Thank you, Jane. Well, we had two wonderful speakers that preceded our last panel today. And before we begin, again, we are wanting to thank profusely the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Foundation for their generous support that enabled us to both visit the sites and conduct our immersion program for faculty, as well as organizing this wonderful conference. And I also would like to thank our colleagues, staff members of Information Services, for your help today, and also catering services. They're probably not here in the room, but still, we just wanted to thank them for putting together the foods and for caring for us with the nice food and the cookies and the refreshments that we have had in these 2 days. So without further notice, I'm going to be introducing the panel on South Africa. The title of the panel is The Challenge of Conserving South Africa's Unique Biodiversity and Ensuring Environmental Justice to Local Populations. And this panel presents the most distinguished faculty at Connecticut College, and I'm going to present them in the order of their participations. So we're going to begin with Professor Mark Zimmer, who is the Jean C. Temple 65 Professor of Physical Sciences and Professor of Chemistry, who is also the director, one of the directors of the South Africa team. Next to him is Professor Chad Jones, who is the George and Carol Milne Assistant Professor of Life Sciences and Professor of Botany and Environmental Studies. We have Professor Derek Turner, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Philosophy Department. We have our inspirational Director of the Faculty Seminar, Professor Jane Dawson, who is the Virginia Eason Wyman 51 Professor of Government and Environmental Studies. We have Professor Doug Thompson, who is Professor of Geology in the Department of Physics, Astronomy, and Geophysics, and also the Carla Hurry Harrison 28, Director of the Roadwin Center for the Environment. And we have Professor Robert Asking, who is the Catherine Blunt Professor and Professor of Biology. So, Professor Zimmer, could you kindly come to the post?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and I guess everybody's been thanked, but I think the students who've been here all the time haven't really been thanked. Well, you've done stellar work sitting here. I think if I'd been 19 or 20, I would have been there and I would have been fast asleep. Just a little confession. So yeah, thanks for staying awake, and hopefully I'm not going to put you asleep at this last hour. Some of you might know me, some of you don't, but from the accent you can probably tell I'm from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is South Africa. And that's why my job here is to tell you a little bit about South Africa and to give you the little background you need about South Africa to see why there are problems between diversity and environmental justice for some groups, and also maybe for you to understand something about South Africa and the obsession with fences and separateness in South Africa. If you go back in history and look at South Africa, what you see is that the indigenous people of South Africa were the Khoi and the San. They were hunter-gatherers and moved around a lot. About 1,000 years ago, the Bantu groups from Central Africa moved down to Southern Africa, and the San and the Khoi moved further down to escape from them. But pretty much at the same time, 1400 and then 1600, first the Portuguese and then the Dutch came to South Africa and started colonizing and pushed the Khoi and the San into the Kalahari Desert, or forced them to assimilate, the two groups. Of course, as usual, when the Europeans came somewhere, they had the superior firepower and they took over, and that's the same in South Africa. So the Dutch colonized South Africa first, then some French Huguenots came from France, escaping religious persecution. Then some Brits came, and it became a British colony. There were 2 British colonies. One was the Cape, which was at the bottom here, and the other was Natal. And then, because the Brits were outlawing slavery, the Dutch, who were then called Boers, moved up into the Free State and the Transvaal, and those became the Boer republics. In 1910, they formed the Union of South Africa. And that was really the start of what we'd sort of know as apartheid. And you can see this whole slew of awful laws that were passed. You can just see by their names, they all suck and stink. In 1948, the Nationalist Party, which was the party that really started apartheid in Afrikaans means separateness, was elected by the white population. When I went to school, I learned it was elected democratically, and that we were a democratic country. But even at that young age, I sort of realized that wasn't quite true. But anyway, the Nationalist Party came up with these 3 laws. The first was the Population Registration Act. That divided the population into 4 groups: whites, Indians who'd come from India to work in the sugarcane, coloreds, who were the Khoi and the San, and mixed race, and then blacks. So you had these 4 groups. No need really to separate people into groups, but much worse than was the Group Areas Act, which said, okay, about 85% of the land is going to belong to the white people, and if you're not a white person, you need something called a passbook, and that passbook is going to have your name, your picture, and it's going to say where you're allowed to be. And if you're black, you can only be in a white area if you've got a job in that area, and you're not allowed to be there at night. So that really changed the whole politics of South Africa. And then there was this insidious Bantu Education Act, which started 4 different education systems, 1 for each of the groups. And basically it was set so that blacks and coloreds especially wouldn't learn anything, trades, that they could do anything but menial work. By the time I was in school in the mid-late 80s, things had changed. There were now 12 racial groups. Every 6 months, there was the population register that came out. It was a list of people who changed their racial group. You could go to a committee, and there was a test to test whether you were black enough or white enough to move from one group to the other. My rebellious youth at university, I had an Indian girlfriend for a while. That was, of course, totally illegal. Had that turned into anything more serious, I would have had to have gone to this committee and tried to have reclassified myself. But once you'd done that and you became Indian or colored, that was it for life. So there were some really odd, strange things about South Africa at the time. One of the consequences of this Group Area Act was that this is a map of Cape Town. Here, this area here, is the central business district. This is where all the shops are. And this is pretty much where, if you want to buy anything in Cape Town, especially in the 60s and 70s, this was really the only place where you could buy something. It was a white area, and at night only whites were allowed to be in this area. Around this area were white urban areas. A little further away were the colored areas. The coloreds were acting as buffers from the black areas. So if you looked at urban development in South Africa, they all look like a dartboard. In the center are the shops, the swimming pools, everything. Then they're the whites, then the coloreds, then if you're in Johannesburg, Indian, and then even further away, blacks. So if you're thinking about something like Cape Town, where this is nature reserve here, all this area is nature reserve, you can imagine the pressure on the biodiversity, because you've got this system where people are living further and further away. If you go and look at the country as a whole, by the 60s, apartheid had been refined to be even nastier, and they developed things called homelands. Homelands were countries that were accepted by America and Taiwan. No other country in the world recognize these as separate countries. But if you, for example, you'd been born in Soweto, outside Johannesburg, and your parents were Xhosas. By the time you got to 16, you could stay there because your father had a job in Soweto. If at 17 you finished high school and you didn't have a job, you were no longer allowed to stay there because Soweto was only for people who worked in Johannesburg, and you were a Xhosa, and so you belonged here in the Transkei. And so at 17 you would be sent to the Homelands, and these areas here were all populated by people who didn't have jobs. These were also the areas where there was no good farmland, where there was nothing really much to do. One of these consequences was in the early 80s, if you looked at the statistics, South Africa has absolutely no AIDS. And I was at university at this time, and I was thinking, well, that's pretty cool. We're really lucky. Well, it turns out South Africa wasn't very lucky. They were just very devious. All black South Africans who got AIDS were sent to their homelands, where they were no longer counted as South Africans, and where, of course, there was no medical care. So these were all sorts of little parts of South Africa that we have to realize when we look at a country like South Africa. Okay, so if we look at a map of South Africa and we look at the population density of South Africa, what we see are the obvious things. This is Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban, East London, Port Elizabeth, Cape Town. Those are the main big cities of South Africa, high density. But you see this area up here where there's really nothing. Very high density of people. That's the homelands. That's where all the unemployed people were sent. Transkei, KwaZulu-Natal, homeland. But we also here, we see this big area, low density of people, right next to the high density of people. Anybody know what that area is? It's the Kruger National Park, a nature reserve. If you look up there, here, it's a nature reserve. Of course, low density of people. If you go back to this map, you can see there really aren't that many nature reserves in South Africa. If you sum up the total area of all the nature reserve in South Africa, it comes up to 4% of the land. You might say to yourself, that's not really much. But then if you go and look at how much land did the Africans possess in South Africa during this time, it turns out they were 86% of the population, but they only had 13% of the land. So having 4%, 3 times as much, being conserved land, being a nature reserve, that's a substantial amount of land. Who governed these parks? Well, these parks were all governed by white Afrikaner males who were all part of the Nationalist Party. And the game rangers, and I wanted to be a game ranger, this was my dream in life, I wanted to be a game ranger in something like the Kruger National Park. At the time I didn't realize this, but now looking back, they were only interested in keeping the biodiversity, but they weren't interested in the people around there or the social issues. Kruger Park is 2 million hectares. It's the size of Connecticut and Massachusetts together. In the 70s and 80s, blacks weren't allowed in the Kruger Park. There was a tiny little fraction right on top. That's the only area where blacks were allowed into the Kruger Park. So it was very, very heavily restricted. Now, Adam just told us about the Nature Conservancy doing all this great work about getting together conservancies. How was the Kruger Park formed? Well, if you go to the Kruger Park, you can see at the bottom here, this is the oldest part. It was formed in 1902. This is Skukuza Park. Skukuza means, in Tsonga, the man who swept away the people. Yeah. This was Colonel Stevenson Thompson was called Skukuza. It wasn't a compliment. And it's because he wiped out all the people who lived here in 1902. But this name still stands. Well, that's 1902, but if we go and look right on the top, there's Pafuri, and this region here, there used to be 5,000 people who lived there. In 1969, not that long ago, they were all forcibly removed, and they had to move from the parks. So there's a bad history between the parks. Now, I left South Africa in 1986, thinking that apartheid was going to be there forever, and then a miracle occurred. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. In 1994 were the first free democratic elections, and I could go back to South Africa. And there was a new constitution, a great new constitution. And one of the acts in the new constitution was the Restitution of Lands Act. It basically said, hey, if those guys took your money, you can apply, your land, you can apply to get your land back. So in 1969, 5,000 people were kicked out at the top of the Kruger Park. They could now ask to get that land back. And in fact, there were 50,000 land claims, people wanting to get their land back. The Group Areas Act disappeared. People could now live wherever they wanted to. Well, this has had a big consequence. If you look at the map of South Africa and look at the density of where people are living, there are not that many people living here anymore, because there's no reason to live there. There are not that many people living here anymore. There are a lot more people living in Cape Town. People have been migrating to Cape Town because that's where the jobs are. They've been migrating to Johannesburg. That's where the jobs are. So what we find is this big pressure on Cape Town, big pressure on Johannesburg. Johannesburg doesn't really matter. It's a big city. It's pretty ugly. But Cape Town, well, you'll hear about Cape Town in a very short little while. That's a lot more interesting. So all these people are coming. 7 million in the last 5 years, refugees from Zimbabwe, from Senegal, from Ethiopia, have also come into South Africa. They all moved to the city because that's where the jobs are. A lot of them go to Cape Town. But if you go and look at Cape Town, it hasn't changed. This is still the main business district. This is still where the whites live. This is still where the coloreds and the blacks live, and there's still an awful amount of pressure on the nature reserves. So that's my little quick introduction into South Africa and Cape Town. Chad will tell us a lot more about Cape Town, the biodiversity, and why this is interesting to us.
Okay, so as Mark said, we went to Cape Town, and it's a very interesting place to go because of, it's a city of about 4 million people, almost. It's growing rapidly. It's in close proximity to this nature reserve and very high levels of biodiversity. So I want to talk first about why we're concerned with the biodiversity in the Cape Town area, what's unique about it, and then we'll talk a little bit about why the conservation approaches that have happened in the past don't work. So this is from Google Maps. So here's Cape Town. So again, the central business district's here. This is the area called Cape Flats. This is where a lot of the colored and black townships are. And then this is Table Mountain National Park, which is the nature reserve. So it's a mountainous area all the way down on the peninsula here. Why is conservation so important in Cape Town? Well, in large part, it's because of the vegetation that's present there, which is called the fynbos ecosystem. And the fynbos ecosystem, it's very structurally similar to the chaparral that you find in California or to the Mediterranean system. So you can see here, shrubs and a variety of other plants. Looks pretty similar to places you could see in other parts of the world. It's another view of it. And structurally, it is very similar to other parts of the world. But if you look at the actual species that are present there, it's very unique. In fact, botanists have historically discussed or created 6 floristic kingdoms across the globe, and they're shown here. And these represent evolutionary lineages, so very different groups of plants, very distinct species groups. And if you look at this, you can see that there's this little tiny one here, the South African floristic kingdom, right? All the other ones, so for example, all of the boreal, so all of the northern temperate regions is all in the same floristic kingdom. But then you have this really small one here. So that means that it's as unique or as different from the rest of the vegetation in a sense as the North American vegetation is from the neotropics. So very, very, very distinct. Also tremendous diversities of plants. So there's about 9,000 species, plant species that are present in an area that's about the size, half the size of New England. And that compares to about 3,500 plant species in all of New England. So about 3 times the number of species for an area about half the size. But even more importantly, 70 to 80% of those 9,000 species are endemic to that region, meaning they don't occur anywhere else in the world, but they're in the fambos, which is, and you can see it mapped here. So it's just a small part of South Africa. And many, well over 1,000 of these species are threatened or endangered as well. So there's tremendous conservation concern for the plants. I want to show you a few of those. The fambos is made up of 4 major groups of plants. So the first ones are the proteas. You can see this is the king protea here. It's maybe the symbol of the fambos. Very, very striking. Several hundred species of protea that occur in the fambos that occur nowhere else in the world. The second group are the Cape reeds, or the rescuos. These are the grass-like plant. Again, several hundred species. This is very distinctive of this area. Some species or other species of Cape reeds occur in other parts of the world, but not the same ones that occur here. The third group are the heaths. Now, the heaths are a group of plants that occur in many places of the world. They're really common in England. They're common in alpine regions here in North America. But again, tremendous diversity of species that you won't find anywhere else. So for example, the genus Erica, there are 3 species in New England that occur here. There's 690 species that occur in the fambos in that small part of South Africa. So incredible diversity of plants that you find nowhere else. The final group are what are called geophytes, or herbs with bulbs. So this includes plants in the iris family, plants in the orchid family, plants in the lily family or the amaryllis family. And this includes the genus Gladiolus. So a lot of the plants that we have cultivated or we grow for flowers here come from South Africa. There's 96 species of Gladiolus in South Africa, in this part of South Africa. This is an orchid, a bunch of lilies and other things as well. So tremendous diversity. It's so unique for a lot of reasons. It's fairly complex, but it has a lot to do with the geology of the system, which is very different. This area is very geologically different than the areas nearby in Africa. It's also very poor nutrients, and there's a lot of disturbance from wind and fire, which have forced some very specific evolutionary adaptations. So there's been tremendous diversification evolutionarily because of those factors. So it's an area particularly interested for botanists, which I'm one, so I was very interested to be there. But it's also interesting for a number of other species. This is one more one that we saw that was pretty interesting, chandelier lily. There's several species of birds that are also endemic to the fambo. So this is the orange-breasted sunbird here, which is on a king protea here, a bird that occurs nowhere else in the world. And then another one, the Cape sugarbird, also again endemic to this region, doesn't occur anywhere else. There's also, so the fambos is not the only reason to be concerned about biodiversity in the Cape Town region. There's also a lot of marine biodiversity. They're one of 4 penguin colonies on the mainland of Africa is in Table Mountain National Park, right in Cape Town. It's actually pretty close to the area here is surrounded by homes and other things, so it's, and obviously watch out for penguins under your vehicles. Penguins are endangered. The African penguin is endangered and declining largely because of overfishing. So the fish that it eats a lot of the fish stocks are declining, and that's leading to declines in penguin populations. So that's a concern for penguins. It's also a concern for other seabirds. So the Cape gannet's another one that's listed as threatened because of declines in its food. You can see fishing fleets from Cape Town. The black-browed albatross is another one that's endangered. In this case, largely because it gets caught in fishing nets and other fishing equipment and gets killed, but again because of overfishing and fishing issues. Another one, we actually saw a bunch of these, is the African black oyster catcher. This is actually a positive story. It's one that has been very endangered, but is actually increasing a little bit. And this one was mostly affected by recreational activities, but we saw probably 15 or 20 of them while we were there, which was pretty cool. And then there's also, in Table Mountain National Park and in the area surrounding Cape Town, it's not just birds and plants either. There's a fair number of mammals and other things, including a number of species of antelope, like the eland, which we saw from a parking lot. And then baboons are pretty common, and actually there's a number of conflicts between baboons and some of these wildlife species and people, because they like to come and sit on cars and break into cars, break into houses and other things like that. So there's a lot of wildlife in close proximity to those 4 million people that live in Cape Town. I just wanted to show this. This is from a paper that came out recently, and this is looking at biodiversity just within the city of Cape Town. So that includes the national park, but it's just within the borders of the town. You can see that there are over 3,000 species of plants that occur within the city boundaries. So that's the same number that you would find in all of New England. And about 190 of those species occur only in the city boundaries of Cape Town, right? Nowhere else in the world. And about 450 of those species are threatened or listed on the red list. But you also have a couple of species of amphibians that occur only in the city and nowhere else, and quite a few endangered or threatened species from a large variety of groups. So it's not just plants, it's not just birds, but there's a tremendous diversity in the area. Okay, so if we think about the way that conservation has happened in the past, as Mark was talking about, so Table Mountain, and this is Table Mountain behind the waterfront of Cape Town, it's kind of an iconic part of Cape Town, at least for the white and for the affluent. And traditional conservation in Cape Town, as well as South Africa, as Mark talked about, has been focused on protecting and setting aside natural areas, such as Table Mountain. But as Mark talked about, the colored and the black and the low-income neighborhoods are far removed from not just the business center right here, but also from the natural areas, from the national park. And so there's an isolation, not just from economic opportunity, but also from the opportunity to experience, to enjoy, and to get the benefits of that natural area and the tremendous biodiversity that's present there. And so this is a legacy of apartheid that reaches not just economically, but also in terms of nature conservation. This is, so you can see here, this is from on top of Table Mountain. You can see the fynbos vegetation, and then you have the large city right next to it, so it's in close proximity. I thought this was a really interesting picture. This is taken from the national park. You can see this is a fairly well-off white neighborhood, and then you have a township that's much poorer, and then you have a landfill in the background. So you have this kind of progressively, as you go farther away from the natural area, getting poorer and poorer neighborhoods. So there's not, in this case, there's not fences that keep people out of the national park, but there is the barrier of lack of transportation, the barrier of distance that does tend to separate many of the people of South Africa from traditional conservation. There's also two other major issues with conservation in the Cape Town area. And the first one is at the Cape Flats area, so this is the area down here that's really flat and low elevation, is also the area that has the highest environmental risks, as we've been talking about over the last couple of days. And that includes things such as flooding, which happens pretty regularly. In fact, I saw a newspaper article just from 2 days ago that said that there was some flooding already in Cape Town this year. And then this is the beach near one of the poor neighborhoods, and we were there, and we saw, you can kind of see the brown water here from sewage outflow. So they do have a nice beach, but not very nice water. So there's a lot of these environmental risks that are largely focused on the Cape Flats region where the poorer people live. And then at the same time, the Cape Flats, so this is a map showing vegetation types in Cape Town. So again, we have the protected area over here. This is what it would have looked like, the different types of vegetation prior to the city really being developed, so 400 years ago. And now white is area that's urban, and the colors are what's left of the vegetation. So the mountain fynbos, which is protected in the national park, is actually still pretty well protected. The lowland fynbos, which are these colors here, has mostly disappeared. And so the bigger conservation issue now is not the mountain fynbos that's protected, it's the vegetation types that are in the lowlands, that are in close proximity to these poorer neighborhoods. And there's a number of species that are very critically endangered that are in these lowland areas in small remnant patches of vegetation that exist there. All right, so at the same time, we have greater environmental risks, but we also have greater conservation risks in these poor areas as well. So to overcome these problems with conservation, with the traditional way of conserving by setting apart a natural area, there needs to be greater connection to the natural world for more people. There needs to be more active conservation in areas that are closer to the people, and there needs to be community buy-in. So we need to have more connections between people and the natural world. And several of my colleagues are going to talk about some of the efforts that are going on in Cape Town to do exactly that. So I'll turn the time over to Derek for the first.
Okay, thanks, Chad. I have just a few slides. I'm going to shift the focus a little bit to questions about people living in the Cape Flats area and their use of local plant resources. So we spent a little bit of time visiting with an NGO that was doing work in the Cape Flats area called the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation. And this NGO was, their basic project was to go through some of the township areas and try to document some of the business activity that's taking place. There's actually quite a lot of business and entrepreneurial stuff going on that's sort of off the grid. It's a part of the informal economy that we've, that's actually come up a couple of times here at the conference. And we decided in our visit to these township areas that we would take a look especially at ways in which people are using local plants. And I have to say a little bit first to set the stage here about the different areas we visited. This is just a map from the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation. We started, you'll see in a moment, we did a bicycle tour, and we started in this neighborhood called Capricorn, which had historically been a township area that was kind of designated for blacks under the apartheid system. We ended up in the Seawinds neighborhood up to the north, which is a little bit more of a suburban neighborhood, a little bit more somewhat nicer suburban housing. It had been a township area that had been designated for colored people, colored communities under the apartheid system. On the way to Seawinds from Capricorn, we bicycled through this other neighborhood, Overcome Heights, which was an informal settlement that had sprung up very, very rapidly in recent years. And this is an example of the kind of settlements that are springing up all over the Cape Flats region as people come into the Cape Town area. So this is just another view, a slightly different shot from the one that Chad just showed a moment ago. See, we started in the kind of neighborhood that's a little bit closer to us, the white suburban neighborhood, which is where the office for the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation was. We hopped on bicycles and rode across the main road, and then toured those communities right between the more affluent areas and the landfill that you see there in the background. This is us stopping and taking things in. This is the first small business that we visited. This was the office of a Sangoma, who's a traditional healer from most of the Sangomas who were in this neighborhood of Capricorn that we visited had come in from the Eastern Cape region since the end of apartheid. And this, you can see some of the things that this guy, Dr. Goburn, was treating. We actually didn't get to meet with Dr. Goburn, the Sangoma. We spoke with this gentleman up in the upper right that you see. He's an herbalist who is working in association with Dr. Goburn. And yet one interesting thing that we learned is the Sangomas treat all kinds of things. The bioethicist in me was really interested in this. They treat everything from, well, you see, arthritis, kidney problems, all the way up to things like marital problems. If you have a if you have to appear in court, if you have a court case, they'll give you something to take to help you. Like all kinds of things that would kind of fall under the heading of what we might think of as counseling. They use lots of plant resources. Interestingly, most of the things that we saw here were actually things that had been collected in other parts of South Africa, largely in the Eastern Cape, because that was the original place where people in this community had lived, and so they were actually collecting things in the Eastern Cape and bringing them back into the Cape Town area for use as medicines. We saw some fascinating things. We all got to pass around some crystallized urine of the rock hyrax that had been collected in the Northern Cape. That was fun. So this was in the community of Capricorn, the first one that we visited. Then we went up to this community just a bit to the north called Seawinds, and this guy, whose name is Neville, was very generous and invited us to his house where he had set up. This is in an area where the urban landscape is actually pretty desolate. He had set up a lovely herbal garden. He's a Rastafarian herbalist who also has a small business preparing herbal teas and remedies, and he had all kinds of different things that he could offer for a variety of different ailments. So things for joint pain and headaches and digestive problems and so on. And he had his own herb garden going on here. You'll note this is kind of in keeping with our theme. He's got a nice barbed wire fence around it to keep people out, which we found very interesting. But you'll notice there in the lower left, he's outside the fence. He had also been working with the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation to set up more of a community-oriented garden outside the fence where anyone in the neighborhood could come by and harvest anything that they might find useful. One other issue that we were very interested in looking at was kind of where the plants were coming from. And as I said a moment ago, the people who had come in from the Eastern Cape were typically gathering a lot of the medicinal plants and other things they were using from the Eastern Cape and Northern Cape. The Rastafarian community, on the other hand, was doing a lot of collecting in the Cape Town area, and in particular in Table Mountain National Park. And this was something that we were left with as something to kind of think a bit about. Neville, in particular, was quite open about the fact that he occasionally gathered things like wild garlic and other plants inside the park. I just wrote down one statistic from the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, which reported that on average per year, about 217 tons of biological material are harvested from the natural areas in the Cape Town region. So there's quite a lot of harvesting going on. So I was kind of left with questions about the sustainability of the harvesting that Neville and others in the Rastafarian community are doing, and how to kind of put that together with the obviously positive kind of urban greening things that he's doing and the very important service that he's providing for others in his neighborhood. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Jane Dawson, who's going to say a little bit more about nature conservation in the Cape Flats area.
Okay, well, as Chad and Derek have both shown, the urban landscape of Cape Town, particularly the enormous flatlands, it's ringed by mountains and by harbor. It's really a vast sprawl of informal settlements, low-cost housing, impoverished communities, and that's mixed in with middle-class suburban neighborhoods as well. So it's sort of an urban wasteland. It's absolutely huge. Here's a picture again. I'm not sure if we're all using the same picture. We kind of posted them all to the same site, so I'm not too sure. But basically, you see down there the flatlands, which is huge, and they're vacant lots, they're deserted factories. It's crisscrossed by highways and by fences, and that was one ubiquitous thing we saw. All of these neighborhoods had fences around them, and we wondered about the fences all the time. But you also see that pockets of biodiversity do dot that urban flatland landscape. There are ponds that are home to egrets and cormorants and eagles. There are wetlands that are home to particularly endangered plants. And also, when we hear about the flooding, they fulfill a very important service to these flood-prone flatlands. So we have pockets of green that are really dotting the urban landscape. And you can see up in through here that we have a lot of these little pockets. In fact, we have something like 23 that have been identified at this point. Well, until 2002, these pockets were not protected or conserved in any way. They weren't part of any of the conservation programs. But in 2002, we get a coalition of like-minded people. They're coming together from Cape Town City, the National Park Service and its Biodiversity Institute, which is SANBI, NGOs, and what's known as Cape Nature, which is the provincial conservation wing for the region. And they came together to put together a 10-year project to develop urban conservation efforts, to turn those pockets into something that protects biodiversity, but also does a lot more. So they had some pretty big goals here. The Cape Flats Nature Project arose out of recognition that most impoverished people living in these Cape Flats area had no chance to interact with nature or to appreciate it. That is, they're not up there on Table Mountain hiking around or going out to these national parks. So if nature was to be protected, either locally or nationally, they needed to work with the urban communities to offer what they have called spiritual and emotional healing to a very stressed population, and to help them to develop an appreciation of what nature has to offer, which is critical then to all of the conservation efforts for the whole country. So the key point for them is community engagement. So I'm really talking specifically about this 10-year project. This is the book they put out of the lessons they learned, hoping that others can use this too. That is bringing in local communities in a meaningful way, not trying to persuade people with words, but to actually bring the local people in, let them see the tangible benefits that are there. The biodiversity and the ecosystem services like flood protection, but also economic benefits, employment opportunities, recreation possibilities, education, and the role that these small pockets can play in building a sustainable society. So from 2002 on, the Cape Flats Nature Project worked to develop a cadre of local, Black and colored, and the terminology is still used in the society, conservators. This is people that are coming right out of these neighborhoods, often out of the townships, who know the communities. So it's not someone from outside, but it's someone from inside. And asking them to find creative ways to bring people into these tiny preserves that are just now in 2013 actually gaining some official recognized preserve status, and to engage them in what is being done there and show them that the preserve can provide something for them. So we met with two of the conservators when we visited one of the sites, Bongani Manisi, an area conservation manager, and Luzanne Isaacs. So they're the two sitting right there next to Mark, as you can see. Luzanne is the reserve manager for Edith Stevens Wetland Park, which Doug is going to talk to you about. And really the enthusiasm and commitment to bring nature to populations whose lives had been carried out entirely in an urban setting, who probably had a life devoid of green spaces and appreciation of nature. Their enthusiasm, their commitment was really very awe-inspiring. The project is based on, and this gives you some of their ideas from their handbook on what to do, it's based on addressing immense environmental injustices in the access to green spaces and nature by impoverished and struggling communities, and show them It's not a case of people versus nature, but nature actually is serving the people in all of these different ways. So many of the flats population never even entered the national parks. This might be their only exposure to nature, though the project expanded then to take people out into the national parks and to carry out excursions. The big challenge to Cape Nature, though, was to figure out how to creatively bring people in, how to make the preserve something that serves their needs and something that they are going to actually value. The project leader is in the center right there, Tanya Lane, and the two Cape Nature Conservators we met with were very candid, telling us that in their 10-year pilot project, there have been a lot of ups and downs in their experiences, a lot of trial and error, and recognition that bringing people in a meaningful way, getting them to appreciate this nature, to see it as useful, was not easy. And that, in fact, the lessons they learned in one setting were not all that easily transferable to another, that they had to really keep on adapting and adapting as they moved from one preserve to another. But they also discovered that hiring this new cadre of conservators, and Luzanne is the one for this particular preserve, and amazingly, enthusiastically, these conservators drawn directly from the communities made a huge difference. So this was really at the core of what made things work. The Cape Flats Nature Project was a 10-year pilot or demonstration program. It completed its work last year and came to an end, something that Tanya was worried about, but we're hoping that this is a good start. The preserves are now in the process of being given legally conserved status, and the provincial conservation authorities are going to be keeping on this system of the new cadre of conservators. So the conservators are now being turned loose. The program ends, they're turned loose to continue the mission. So far, everything we could see, the urban conservation experiment was being very, very successful. Obviously, time is going to tell on this one. The project also was locally based. That is, based in Cape Town. It was mainly overseen by West Cape Provincial Conservation Authorities, that is, Cape Nature. So the hope is that maybe they've created a model that can be carried, transplanted to other areas in South Africa, and they're talking to other urban areas about that as well. But just to get a sense of what an urban green space can mean to a local community, we want you to look at one specific case, the case that we went to. And that's one that you can see there's a railroad around it, there's a highway around it, there's a township, an impoverished community, and there are fences around it. And yet, this has become really a center that brings people together. So I'll turn this over for Doug to explain.
Thank you, Jane. So, it was a wonderful trip in general to South Africa. We saw, great animals and so forth. And surprisingly, I guess, in many ways, it was actually, for me at least, Seawinds Wetland Park that was one of the highlights of the whole trip. And it was because of the way it functions in the greater community. So, as Jane pointed out, it's part of this bigger effort, and it's playing an important role, as you'll see. So, in particular, there are a whole bunch of different reserves, but we're talking about this one here, the Seawinds Wetland Park. Chad gave us a very good overview of the fynbos and how important it is in general, and in particular how in this region, in the center here, is some of the most fragmented and endangered of the plants and animals. So it's an important area, and therefore the preserve plays a very important role in that. As we kind of saw, the preserve in some ways is an island of nature really surrounded by a very urban environment. And it's got 3 townships around it that all have kind of different groups associated with them. The preserve itself is important in terms of preservation of certain species. So there are 7 endangered species of plants located there that are found nowhere else. There are 5 types of 5 species of amphibians, including 1 endangered species. There are lots of birds that use this. A total of 95 species have been identified as using the preserve, even though the preserve is only 39 hectares, so not that large. There are 5 species that use these little islands here as nesting areas. They're mostly wetland species of birds. So there's a kind of biological function. We were lucky enough to see a bunch of different species. They were all frantically running away from this fish eagle. It was kind of flying around terrorizing all the other birds. But again, it was from a nature perspective and kind of a protection perspective, an important preserve. There are 10 mammal species, no particularly large mammals because of the size of the preserve and its kind of isolation. And so as a result of that, the fences play a little bit less a role. So you can see there's kind of a fence in the background here, but it's not necessarily the tall, more imposing fences that we'll see in the next site, and that we saw really throughout our visit to South Africa. There are also 12 reptile species. So you can see that there is kind of some protection, biodiversity function of the preserve. But really, I think what we learned is more the role that this reserve is playing with the community. Again, as Jane pointed out, this is a really remarkable woman, incredibly articulate, very knowledgeable, extremely passionate. Lizanne Isaacs was a real highlight of my visit, just listening to her talk and the passion she brings. And the real key is that the focus here is really connecting the community to the issue of biodiversity and preserving biodiversity. This is kind of showing kind of the area here. So this is part of the infrastructure of the facility. They've got these kind of nice overlook areas and so forth. And we learned basically, and listening to Luzanne, some of the projects, and I think it's really the case studies that kind of bring this home. So one of the problems in the area are with exotic invasive plant species, in particular in the river, the Lotus River that kind of flows through this area. So this is a detention pond that's kind of associated with that river environment. So the city's been concerned about this and has had projects going on that they've hired workers to kind of deal with this invasive species problem, but it was kind of limited success. So when the Edith Stevens staff got involved and they kind of took their own approach to this, again, they hired people from the local community, but they put a real emphasis on educating the community about the importance of what they were doing. And as Lizanne said, that as these two groups kind of interacted, these groups of workers and so forth, pretty soon her workers, the ones she had kind of educated and brought along the process, were actually starting to teach the other employees that, from the city. And the employees said that they'd been doing the project for 2 years and they had never known why they were even doing it. And I think that's the real key. It's not so much just about getting the plants out. It's about getting the plants out and getting the community to understand, the value of that, and getting them to support the project, because that's the only chance there is that the projects like this can actually be sustainable. Another kind of example of kind of her I guess, brilliance in getting community involvement and buy-in involved kind of this portion of the preserve. So this was an area where it's kind of a flat area, and so it was an attractive location for local people to start playing soccer in, or football, as they say in South Africa. The area is, of course, from the staff's perspective, important for biodiversity preservation. So there was some concern about use of it as a playing field, but the reality is that the townships don't have many facilities. We saw what was considered a field in the township that Derek talked about, and I certainly wouldn't have wanted to play a soccer game there, and we didn't see anyone in this, what was considered open space field area. So something like this is a very attractive location. But instead of kicking the individuals out, what she did was got them involved in the actual work of the preserve and got them involved in some of the restoration efforts, and tried to focus on working to preserve certain areas and maybe come up with areas within the reserve where some other uses like soccer might be more permissible, and get them again to understand the value, and that, as we've kind of heard, not all land is necessarily equal in terms of its importance of biodiversity. So, staying off off maybe some of these areas where the biodiversity is a little bit more critical and moving to some of the more upland areas. So in addition to these functions, one of the interesting things I learned was that the reserve serves a general community function as well that goes beyond biodiversity. So it happens to be located in amongst 3 different townships, and there are, unfortunately, drug and gang problems associated with some of these townships. So the reserve actually serves as a neutral ground, and so they've actually had group meetings, where this is kind of a safe place to have peaceful communications between the rival gangs. Again, serving much more of a community function than really a biodiversity function in that case. And again, it's a way to get the community to see the value of these areas. In addition to that, other groups are using the facilities, which are very nice, obviously, for counseling services. Again, not necessarily directly related to biodiversity, but it's a place for people to meet and be in a more peaceful setting. So again, as a kind of a place for counseling, it's served an important function. Sorry, went too far. And lastly, there's been a lot of involvement of local individuals just coming and using the preserve on a daily basis just to be kind of in a more natural setting, but also getting involved as individuals in the restoration efforts. And I think Luzanne is particularly good at kind of drawing people in and getting mothers and family members involved in what's going on in the reserve. And I think we're seeing that it's not just about preserving plants and animals and so forth. It's really about building community around resources. In this case, a very important resource for biodiversity, but as we saw, it's also become a very important resource for the community.
As the other speakers have indicated, the main focus of our trip was on Cape Town. We spent about a week in Cape Town, and it was an ideal location for the sort of thing we were concerned about, global environmental justice. Here you have these globally significant conservation areas embedded within a large city with lots of social justice problems and environmental and economic equity issues. But we also thought we should see a more traditional African park to see what was happening in rural areas. Most national parks in Africa focus on wildlife conservation, especially of large mammals such as elephants and lions. And for that reason, we traveled eastward to Port Elizabeth to Addo Elephant National Park. This park is located in the Eastern Cape near Port Elizabeth. Cape Town is in this area. It turns out there is a connection, however. The Eastern Cape is a relatively economically depressed area. It's traditionally an agricultural area, and agriculture has been declining. A lot of the people who live in the Cape Flats area in Cape Town have moved there from the Eastern Cape. And so one solution to the problems of Cape Town is economic development in the Eastern Cape so that there isn't so much movement into Cape Town. Addo Elephant National Park is one of the best-known parks in South Africa. It isn't as well known in North America. I think most people think of Kruger National Park when they think of South Africa, but within South Africa, it's known as one of the premier national parks. It's located here. Here's Port Elizabeth. It's only about an hour away from Port Elizabeth, so it's convenient to a large urban population who can easily visit Addo. And you can see that it's quite extensive. It started out as a relatively small park, but has now expanded to 445,000 acres. The area around Port Elizabeth and Addo was originally occupied by the Khoi ethnic group. They're culturally similar to the San, who live in the Kalahari, the so-called Bushmen. In the 1700s, there was a major smallpox epidemic that really decimated the Khoi, and the Xhosa people moved into this area. They practiced more intensive agriculture and herding. So during much of the 1700s, they dominated. And then in the early 1800s, the area was taken over by the Boers, who moved in with an army of about 1,000 soldiers and pushed both the Khoi and the Xhosa out of this region. During the 1800s, the wildlife in this area was decimated as agriculture spread. This became an area of privately owned farms. It was an important citrus, and still is, an important citrus growing area. And so citrus plantations spread along the Sundays River Valley, which borders Addo National Park. There was a lot of ivory hunting and also hunting for meat, but the main problem was habitat destruction from the spread of agriculture. Citrus and elephants don't mix. Elephants love oranges and grapefruit, and so they were constantly raiding the orange orchards. And the farmers would shoot them, but finally they appealed to the government to get rid of these pesky elephants. By that time, there were only 140 elephants left in the entire region, and a famous elephant hunter, Major Pretorius, was commissioned to come into this area to completely eradicate the elephants, and he was able to shoot 114 of them. He had a special suit made of leather so he could walk through the thickets that have lots of thorns and sneak up on the elephants. And he was an expert at eradicating elephants and was very effective. And he would have succeeded, except one farmer, J.T. Harvey, decided he did not want to see the last elephants go. And so he protected the elephants on his land, and this became the core of a wildlife preserve. There were only about 20 elephants left, 22 elephants left at this point, but he protected them. And in 1931, this became Addo National Park, and originally it was 5,000 acres. There was a constant problem of elephants trying to go out of the park to raid orange groves, and so they would chase the elephants back in, and eventually they started to provision the elephants with oranges. They would take waste oranges from the orchards, bring them into the park to feed the elephants. In 1954, the director of the park, Graham Armstrong, solved this problem by building one of the first elephant-proof fences. That's much more difficult to do than it might seem. And so with trolley railings and cables, they were able to build a fence that was strong enough to keep the elephants in. And they continued to provision the elephants. They brought in more and more oranges as the elephant population grew, and this became a major problem because the elephants would hang around the area where the oranges were delivered every day, and they knew what time the oranges were delivered. They would chase the trucks and try to steal the oranges off the trucks. There was a tremendous amount of social stress because the females were being bullied by the bulls. They were trampling all the vegetation, and finally they decided to phase this out in the 1970s. And by 1979 they had ended this policy. In the 80s there was much more of a policy to manage the park, not just for elephants, but for general biological diversity. And so there was a shift in the management plan for the park. When we arrived in Port Elizabeth, the first thing we did was go to South African National Park's office. The headquarters for park planning and development happened to be in Port Elizabeth. This is for the entire South African National Park system. And we were amazed that we got to meet with the Director of Conservation and Development of the entire South Africa National Park system, Michael Knight, who spent about an hour describing the general philosophy of South Africa National Parks, but Addo in particular. We also met with other staff members, both at Port Elizabeth and the next day when we were at Addo National Park at the park headquarters. We met with the head of the Marine Reserve. There's a marine component to Addo National Park, as well as the Director of Terrestrial Conservation. So I think we got a very full overview of how the park is being managed. Since the 1990s, there's been a very ambitious strategic conservation plan for Addo National Park. And the main goal is to connect the coast, this area, which is dominated by giant dunes and coastal forests, and the desert. So the park goes from the coast up to the top of the mountains where there's feinboss of the sort that you heard about from Chad Jones. And on the other side of the mountain, there's semi-desert habitat. So this park now encompasses 7 biomes, everything from the semi-desert karoo habitat to feinboss to Afro-montane forest. And the stippled areas, the green crosshatched areas, are the areas that they hope to acquire in the future. From the beginning, the park has expanded from that original 5,000 acres, little by little, by buying private farms from white farmers. So it's different from the history of Kruger. After apartheid ended, there was only one land claim involving Addo National Park, where land had been expropriated from a local community, and that was settled by coming up with a joint economic plan between the community and the park so that the community would benefit from tourism. The elephant fence is still there, and in fact, you can't go into the park except on a guided tour between sundown and sunup. And this really massive fence separates the park from the surroundings. It also, the fences are around all of the areas where tourists stay to keep you from being eaten by lions and stepped upon by elephants. An important point in this part of the world. A lot of the focus is still on elephant conservation, and there are now hundreds of elephants in the park. Many people come to the park mainly to see the elephants. In the process of saving the elephants, J.T. Harvey also saved a lot of other wildlife just by setting aside this 5,000 acres. And so the park inherited not only elephants, but also species like greater kudu, warthogs are abundant, Cape buffalo, and zebra. All of these species are common in the park, plain zebra. But there's also been a major effort to restore ecosystems within the park because a lot of species and habitats were lost. A lot of parts of the park had been farmland, and so they have to be restored to natural vegetation. This is former farmland that's being planted with native shrubs to recreate the thicket, to restore the thicket. And a number of species have been reintroduced from other parts of southern Africa. A red hartebeest, spotted hyena. They thought that spotted hyena was an especially important species to restore in order to restore a major scavenger and predator. They reintroduced African lions from the Kalahari Desert for the same reason. Recently, they've even reintroduced this bird, the red-billed oxpecker, which seems like an insignificant part of the ecosystem, but oxpeckers specialize on removing ticks and other parasites from large mammals like rhinos and Cape buffalo and antelopes, and so they're an important part of this ecosystem, particularly if you're a rhino covered with ticks. So, but the focus has remained on elephants, and there was a recent study of the attitude of visitors about the park, why they had come to the park, what they'd learned about the park, and the goal of the survey was to find out how much they learned about biological diversity. And the conclusion was that most visitors had mainly learned about elephants and very little else, that they had focused mostly on elephants. And so they were missing a large amount of the diversity of the park. Many species of birds that are endemic to southern Africa, smaller mammals like golden mongoose. These photographs, by the way, were all taken by a group, mostly by Doug Thompson, who happens to have the best telephoto lens, so we can credit him with most of this. On this survey, just about the only small organism that people pointed out was the dung beetle, which is kind of surprising. These are large flightless beetles that roll a perfect sphere of elephant dung and roll it away in order to form a nest to raise their young. I think people were aware of these because there are all these signs telling you not to run over the dung beetles, so people at least were aware of dung beetles. But they found that if people went on guided tours, they had a much better understanding of biological diversity, and they saw something beyond the usual elephants and Cape buffalo and large mammals. With the end of apartheid and the elections of 1994, there was a major change in the way South Africa's national parks were run. The government now mandated that the parks work for economic development and social justice, and to take into account all of the communities around a park. And there are 8 communities bordering Addo. It was clear to us that the park took this very seriously. We talked to 6 staff members, and all of them emphasized this equally with protection of biological diversity. So they now see it as part of their mission. At Addo, a development trust, the Mayabue and Ndlovu Development Trust, has been formed in order to provide a nonprofit group and a community group with a liaison to the national park. So the Development Trust has 2 representatives from each of the 8 communities. It has representatives from the citrus industry, 1 representative, and then some representatives from the national park. We had a presentation by Roland Corollas, who is a former director of the trust. He now works for Addo National Park, and he explained some of their programs. Some of these programs listed here are sponsored mainly by the trust. Others are kind of national programs that are sponsored by South Africa National Parks. One of their successful programs has been a Hop-On Guide program. Most of the visitors to Addo bring their own cars rather than going on guided tours. And what the Park Service now does, along with the trust, is train local people to be guides, to be wildlife guides and park guides. And when you drive into the park, you can hire a guide to join you in your car and give you a local perspective. And this provides well-paying jobs. It also provides an opportunity for advancement, because some of these hop-on guides have gone on to become professional guides at private nature preserves, of which there are quite a few in South Africa. 1% of the funds that come from accommodations, restaurants, guided tours within the national park goes to the local community. So any tourism within the park benefits the 8 local communities. There's a program to assist students in the local schools. There's a preschool program, also a large scholarship program that's provided support for many students from the local communities to go to university. Perhaps the most important thing is employment and park concessions. With the expansion of the park, there was no direct expropriation of land from local communities, but there was a loss of labor, a loss of jobs, because as the farms were subsumed within the park, the jobs for farm laborers disappeared. And so the park is mandated to provide job opportunities for people who lose their jobs because of park expansion. And this can involve anything from custodial services to staff positions within the national park. Many of the positions are with concessions, lodges, and restaurants within the park. And the wages are much higher than for farm laborers, on average at least twice as high as the original farm labor wages. The park also sponsors, through the Development Trust, educational programs for local communities. And one of the most promising projects is the Work for Water program, which is done in conjunction with a compost program. This is partially initially supported by the European Union, but it looks like it has a good potential of becoming a profitable enterprise. It's sponsored directly by the Mayabua and Dovlo Development Trust. They have cleared 75,000 hectares of invasive species along waterways within the national park. And this helps to restore the water table in the park. A lot of these invasive species were sucking up a lot of the water in the park. That's why the focus is on water. But they then compost the plants that they harvest and sell the compost to local farmers, particularly citrus farmers, and this has been very successful. They were able to turn invasive species into a commercial product, and it employs a large number of people. Unlike parks in the United States and Canada, parks in South Africa are largely self-supporting. 70 to 80% of the support for parks has to come from tourism. And so Addo has a large number of lodges, and they're pretty expensive lodges. About 40% of the visitors are from overseas, mainly from Europe, from the Netherlands and Germany. About 60% are from South Africa. I think a serious problem is that very few of the visitors are African or colored. Most of the visitors are white. There just is not a tradition of visiting national parks because of the history of apartheid. And one of the big challenges for the parks in South Africa, I think, for their long-term sustainability will be gaining support from the 80% of the population that really is not benefiting from these parks, and to expand their mandate to cover the entire population, not just a small part of the population. I'd like to end by thanking the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Foundation for supporting this 2-year program, and to Jane Dawson for keeping us on track for 2 years in frequent seminars, reading groups. There was a lot more that went into this than just 10 days of traveling in India or Peru or South Africa, and finally to bringing us to a combination with this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I think that we have a little bit of time for a few questions from the audience before I pass on the podium to Jane for her concluding remarks. So, any questions, please? Yes, Jeff.
That is, I know that elephants have a very complicated social structure, verbally, great memory, and I'm wondering what kind of placebo do you offer to an orange-tipped elephant? Is it just straight cold turkey?
What kind of what? Oh, placebo. So the question is that elephants have a very complicated social life, have a very complex way of relating to each other and to nature. And so the question is, what kind of placebo was used to replace? Oh, what was used to get them unhooked from the oranges and the grapefruits and the citrics?
They weaned them off over a period of 2 years, giving them less every time and coming less frequently. So, yeah, just like a baby.
It's the same problem as with grizzly bears at Yellowstone, where they were coming to dumps, and there was a big controversy about whether they should end the dumps. You know, these were big bear viewing areas. The same with the elephants. At one point they had platforms around the citrus feeding area where people could sit and watch the elephants. And I think it took longer in Yellowstone. It took about 10 years because they were worried about that the grizzly bears would run amok and attack campgrounds and that sort of thing. But with the elephants, I suspect it wasn't quite as difficult. Oh, they did have signs coming into the park for a long time saying, "Don't bring oranges in," though.
And for the elephants to read. Yes, please.
Do you find that the fences for the elephant park serve kind of a dual purpose, not only keeping the elephants in, but maybe poachers are studying the problem?
Well, I think that poaching is a problem. The poaching that they talked to us about was rhinos primarily, and the people who are doing the poaching there are really organized with helicopters and things like that. So in terms of the poaching that they had as a real issue, the fences were not particularly effective for keeping them out because it was these really well-organized groups.
One other interesting detail about poaching is in Addo, many of the elephants don't have tusks, and this is just due to historical accident. There were a couple of females in the original very small herd that had a kind of genetic variation and didn't have tusks, and then that tuskless trait got passed on. And that has actually helped protect the elephants in the park from poaching, though they are trying to introduce elephants from elsewhere to try to have a herd in the future that does have tusks.
Yeah, unfortunately with the poaching, it's a very kind of hit and run activity. So the park does have radio transmitters on the rhinoceroses in particular, so they know where they are. That's not information they make public, obviously, and they try to, in fact, kind of hide how many rhinos they have. But we were told that one of the problems is if someone knows where a rhino is, they literally come in with a helicopter, butcher the animal and just fly out. So it's not a question of this kind of slow process of coming into the park and hunting. It's pretty much if someone knows where it is, they will kind of fly in, fly out. So it's a really hard thing to guard against, unfortunately.
Yes, please. Can you speak loud?
Hi, this is for Professor Turner. Do you see an ethical difference between poaching threatened plant species and poaching rhinos for ivory, especially since they're both used for traditional medicine?
So the question is about poaching and what is truly the goal of poaching and if there's a difference.
Yeah. Wow, this is a tough one. I've been kind of ruminating over this and struggling with it ever since we returned. I'm not really sure. I guess if you think of poaching in legal terms as just kind of any illegal collection, within the park, then the sort of thing that someone like Neville was doing would count as poaching. But gosh, I definitely have different ethical intuitions about this sort of activity he was engaging in, which had all kinds of positive benefits for his community. It was also small scale. He himself certainly wasn't collecting anything in any very large quantities. The kind of activity he was engaging in looks, at least at first glance, kind of sustainable. So, yeah, that's just a really tough one. Are these things in the same category? Yeah.
I guess as a botanist, I would say poaching endangered plants would fall under the same category as poaching endangered animals.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other question?